47 minutes. That's how long it took before anyone in Dubai's Emergency Operations Center picked up a phone and started calling American defense contractors about what happened at 2:14 that morning, not 47 minutes to confirm the blast. 47 minutes before anyone started talking. I've been analyzing asymmetric warfare for years, and I can tell you exactly what 47 minutes of silence means inside that building. It doesn't mean confusion. It doesn't mean they were gathering facts. It means the people who answer the phones already knew what happened, and they needed time to figure out what version of the truth they were going to tell the 18 American defense companies whose regional headquarters just became targeted assets. Here's what they eventually said. 3 sentences. A minor industrial fire occurred at a commercial facility in Dubai Silicon Oasis. Civil defense teams responded. The incident is under investigation. That's it. No mention of the 22-story glass tower that lost its entire ground floor. No mention of the 340 American engineers who work in that building. No mention of the 8-meter-wide crater in the parking garage. That crater is the thing nobody is talking about, because minor industrial fires don't leave craters. Before I show you what Iran just proved about the safety of American military assets overseas, hit subscribe. This is War Conflict. I post forensic breakdowns of every major escalation. And this is the one that should keep every defense executive awake tonight. The UAE government called it a minor industrial fire. That sentence should terrify every American defense contractor with overseas operations. Not because it's false, because of what it chooses not to say. The building at Dubai Silicon Oasis was not random. It was the regional headquarters of a major Pentagon contractor, the kind of company that builds guidance systems for the F-35, radar arrays for THAAD, classified communications for every special operations unit in the Middle East. That building housed 340 American engineers, logistics planners, and program managers, civilians, working for a company whose sole client is the U.S. Department of Defense, and Iran knew exactly what floor they were on. The blast occurred at 2:14 a.m. The building was nearly empty. Only a night security crew and 2 IT staff. 0 American casualties. 0 fatalities. That is not a coincidence. That is a message. Iran could have struck at 2:14 p.m. They could have killed 300 American contractors. They could have forced a full U.S. military response. They chose not to, because they didn't need to kill anyone to win this exchange. I want to be clear. The Pentagon has not officially confirmed Iranian responsibility for this blast, but the physical evidence, the crater, the targeting notifications, the 47-minute silence, tells a story that official statements are choosing not to. Here's the detail almost nobody has pulled on, because when you pull on it, the entire story changes shape. The 18 companies that received targeting notifications include Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, L3 Harris, and 13 smaller subcontractors. Every single one has a presence in the UAE. Every single one is now recalculating whether that presence is worth the risk. The notifications arrived 47 minutes before the blast. Not threats, not warnings, not negotiation demands, targeting notifications, as in, we know where you are, we know what you're building, we know your shift schedules, and your host country cannot protect you. The Iranian intelligence penetration required to pull this off is staggering. They knew the floor plans. They knew the security rotations. They knew that 2:14 a.m. was the window when the building would be empty enough to send a message without triggering a war. This is not a militia with drones. This is a state actor with human intelligence assets inside one of the most heavily surveilled business districts in the Middle East. And here's what the mainstream coverage is missing. The question isn't what Iran destroyed. The question is what Iran proved. For roughly 20 years, American defense contractors operated in the Gulf under an assumption. The UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, these are safe rear areas. You can put your regional headquarters there, you can fly your engineers in and out, you can store sensitive equipment, and host country security backed by U.S. intelligence will keep Iranian threats at a distance. The U.S. knew Iran had intelligence assets in the Gulf. The bet was on the execution gap, that Iran couldn't translate that intelligence into a precision strike on a defended target without triggering a war they didn't want. Yesterday suggests that assessment needs revision, because here's what Iran just proved. They can strike at the heart of American military-industrial infrastructure in an allied nation. The host country's response will be to call it a minor industrial fire, and the United States cannot retaliate without embarrassing the very allies whose bases it needs. That is not a military defeat. That is a question mark over $200 billion worth of overseas defense infrastructure. And question marks are harder to kill than missiles, okay, the number you haven't seen anywhere else. The direct cost of the Dubai strike, building damage, business interruption, security response, is approximately $87 million. Iran spent, by conservative intelligence estimates, roughly $2.3 million on the operation. That's a 1-to-38 ratio. Iran spent $1 for every $38 of direct damage. But the direct damage is not the story. The indirect cost is. The 18 targeted companies have already seen their stock prices drop an average of 4.2%. That's $23 billion in market capitalization erased. The cost of security upgrades, hardened perimeters, drone detection systems, armed response teams is estimated at $1.7 billion across the 18 companies. The workforce anxiety cost, retention bonuses, hazard pay, recruitment difficulties is harder to calculate. But defense industry recruiters estimate a 15 to 20% premium for Gulf postings going forward. Here's the number that actually matters. The United States government is now reviewing whether to reimburse defense contractors for security costs in allied nations. Because if contractors start pulling out of the Gulf, American military logistics collapse. That reimbursement, if approved, will cost American taxpayers approximately $800 million to $1.2 billion annually. Iran spent $2.3 million to force a potential $1 billion annual liability onto the U.S. defense budget. That is the most efficient asymmetric attack in the history of this conflict. The United States doesn't have a good move here. I mean that precisely. Both available paths lead to the same destination. Option 1. Retaliate militarily against Iran for striking a civilian commercial facility in a third country. The problem? The UAE is calling it a minor industrial fire. They don't want a war on their soil. A U.S. retaliatory strike would embarrass the UAE government and potentially end American access to Gulf military bases. Option 2. Accept the strike as the new normal. Increase security. Protect the contractors. Absorb the cost. The problem with this approach is that it invites repetition. If Iran can strike Dubai with impunity, they can strike Bahrain, Qatar, anywhere American defense contractors operate within 1,500 kilometers of Iranian territory. And here's the trap. The more the United States spends on protecting contractors in the Gulf, the less it spends on weapon systems, the less it spends on troop readiness, the less it spends on the things that actually deter Iran. Iran doesn't need to win a military engagement. They need to force the United States to choose between protecting its economic assets and maintaining its military edge. That choice, once presented, cannot be unpresented. Here's what makes this harder to talk about than it should be. The UAE cannot acknowledge what happened. The United States cannot acknowledge the full extent of Iranian penetration into Gulf security. The targeted contractors cannot acknowledge their vulnerability without spooking investors. So everyone calls it a minor industrial fire. Not because they believe it, but because the alternative, admitting that Iran can strike American military industrial assets in allied nations at will, creates a political and economic crisis with no clean resolution. The silence is not a cover-up. The silence is a choice between bad options. And everyone chose the one that buys time. The 18 companies just got targeted. The question is not whether more strikes will come. The question is whether the next one happens at 2:14 a.m. or 2:14 p.m. Here's my question for you in the comments. Should the United States reimburse defense contractors for security costs in the Gulf? Or should companies that choose to operate within Iranian missile range bear the financial risk themselves? I read every comment. The best ones I'll address in a follow-up. The source documents, including the list of targeted companies, Dubai civil defense reports, and defense industry security cost assessments, are linked in the description. If you made it this far, you understand that the next war won't start with a missile. It will start with an insurance premium. This is war conflict. I'll see you in the next one.